The East India Company began as a group of merchants and somehow ended up with an army larger than Britain's, its own wars, a global drug empire, stolen kingdoms, and enough arrogance to tack salt behind a 1,500-mile hedge. These are 30 of the weirdest facts about the corporation that treated half the world like a hostile takeover. 1. During the First Opium War, Chinese commanders expected a familiar naval fight. Then the East India Company sent in the Nemesis, an iron-hulled steam warship that looked like someone had dropped the Industrial Revolution into a wooden fleet. Chinese junks relied on sails, favorable wind, and centuries of tradition. The Nemesis relied on metal, steam, heavy guns, and absolutely no respect for tradition. It could move against the wind, enter shallow rivers, smash through smaller vessels, and keep firing, while the defenders struggled to understand what they were facing. This was not simply a better ship. It was a preview of modern industrial warfare arriving decades early. The company used that technological gap to force open Chinese markets and defend the illegal opium trade, proving that advanced machinery could turn corporate greed into national catastrophe. 2. Modern people panic when a corporation gains too much political influence. The East India Company would have found that adorable. At its height, this private business controlled more than 260,000 troops, making its army roughly twice the size of Britain's official royal forces. It had infantry, cavalry, artillery, warships, officers, forts, and permission to wage actual wars. Imagine Walmart owning aircraft carriers, Amazon annexing provinces, and shareholders voting on military invasions between discussions about shipping costs. That was not a metaphor. Company executives in London could approve campaigns against rulers thousands of miles away because conquest looked profitable on paper. The East India Company was technically a merchant enterprise, but in practice it operated like a heavily armed state with a logo, a payroll department, and a terrifying commitment to quarterly growth. 3. The East India Company had a pirate problem, so it hired William Kidd to hunt pirates across the Indian Ocean. Brilliant plan, except Kidd soon discovered that catching criminals was difficult, dangerous, and badly rewarded, while becoming one was much more profitable. Armed with a company-backed ship and official protection, he gradually crossed the line from privateer to pirate and began attacking vessels himself. In other words, the company financed, equipped, and launched one of the very men it later condemned as a notorious outlaw. This may be the worst security hire in corporate history. It was like paying a burglar to guard your house, giving him the keys, and then expressing shock when the furniture disappears. Kidd was eventually captured and executed, but the embarrassing part remained. The anti-piracy contractor had upgraded himself into the piracy department. 4. The East India Company's story eventually produced one of history's most satisfying corporate reversals. After centuries of ruling territory, extracting wealth, and helping build British power in India, the dormant brand was purchased in 2005 by Indian businessman Sanjeev Mehta. Yes, the company that once treated India like private property ended up becoming the property of an Indian entrepreneur. Mehta rebuilt the old name as a luxury brand, selling tea, chocolate, fine foods, and expensive gifts rather than armies, annexations, and taxation. The symbolism is almost too perfect. A corporation that once profited from the subcontinent now sells premium products under the control of a man from Mumbai. Empires may collapse, monopolies may vanish, and flags may change, but history occasionally delivers an Uno reverse card so clean that even a screenwriter would be told it feels unrealistic. 5. The East India Company publicly represented a Christian empire that often treated Indian religions as backward. Yet, when money appeared, theology became strangely flexible. For years, the company helped administer the famous Jagannath Temple at Puri, organizing festivals, maintaining the institution, and collecting taxes from pilgrims. British officials were not doing this out of religious respect or spiritual curiosity. They were doing it because pilgrimage generated revenue. The result was wonderfully absurd. Christian colonial administrators effectively acting as managers for a Hindu temple, making sure rituals ran smoothly because disrupted worship meant disrupted income. Conversion could wait, the cash box could not. This was the East India Company's real creed in action. It did not matter which god people prayed to, which idol stood inside the sanctuary, or which festival filled the streets, as long as the company received its percentage before everyone went home. 6. The East India Company removed so much wealth from India that its employees carried home not only treasure, but vocabulary. The English word loot comes from the Hindi and Urdu word lut, meaning plunder or stolen goods. Company officers encountered the term while seizing jewels, money, artworks, and valuables across the subcontinent, then imported it into everyday English along with everything else they could fit on a ship. Few words could better represent the organization's legacy. A corporation famous for aggressive extraction helped give the world a universal term for grabbing whatever is not nailed down. Today, gamers open loot boxes, armies loot cities in history books, and criminals divide their loot after a robbery. Most people using the word have no idea they are repeating linguistic evidence of 18th century colonial theft. Even the English language left India carrying suspiciously heavy luggage. 7. Stamford Raffles is remembered as the founder of modern Singapore, but his greatest success began as an act of workplace disobedience. The East India Company directors had warned him not to provoke the Dutch and not to acquire expensive new territory. Raffles responded by doing exactly that. He found a local royal succession dispute, backed the claimant who suited his plan, recognized him as the rightful ruler, and secured permission to establish a British trading post on Singapore. London was furious when the news finally arrived and considered removing him. Unfortunately for the directors, the unauthorized settlement was already becoming extremely profitable. Suddenly, the reckless employee looked like a visionary. Raffles proved one of the company's most reliable management principles: ignore every instruction, create an international crisis, and you may still receive praise if the revenue arrives before the disciplinary letter. 8. The telegraph helped connect the British Empire, but it also helped destroy the East India Company. For generations, distance had protected company officials from supervision. Messages between India and London could take months, which meant governors could start wars, annex kingdoms, spend fortunes, and then explain everything after the consequences were impossible to reverse. By the time headquarters objected, the territory was already conquered and the bill had already arrived. Telegraph communication changed that. London could demand updates quickly, issue instructions, and interfere before ambitious officials created another empire-sized surprise. The company lost one of its greatest advantages, being far enough away to act first and apologize later. Once the British government could communicate directly with India, the corporate middleman looked less necessary. Instant messaging did what armies and scandals had failed to do. It made remote management possible and corporate secrecy much harder. 9. The doctrine of lapse was one of the East India Company's most shameless methods of acquiring territory without openly admitting it was stealing kingdoms. Under this policy, if an Indian ruler died without a biological son, the company could reject his adopted heir and absorb the state. Adoption had long been accepted in Indian royal succession, but the company suddenly decided that local custom did not count whenever valuable land was available. States such as Satara and Jhansi were annexed through this legal trap. No battle was required. The company simply waited for a ruler to die, inspected the family tree, and declared itself the winner. Imagine a bank seizing your home because your children were adopted, and therefore, according to a rule the bank invented yesterday, your family no longer existed. It was conquest performed with paperwork, seals, and the confidence of a thief wearing reading glasses. 10. 18th century Britain loved tea so much that sellers could apparently mix almost anything into it and still find customers. Used leaves were dried, recolored, and bulked out with cheap rubbish, including floor sweepings and animal waste. Some dealers added copper-based chemicals to make the mixture look fresh and green, turning a fashionable drink into a toxic chemistry experiment. Wealthy guests could sit in elegant drawing rooms, raise delicate porcelain cups, and praise the refined flavor while swallowing recycled leaves, poisonous dye, and possibly sheep dung. Nothing says civilized society like drinking barnyard debris from imported China. The East India Company's tea monopoly encouraged a huge market where demand was enormous and regulation barely existed. Long before modern food labels, consumers had no idea whether they were buying premium tea or a beautifully packaged agricultural crime scene with boiling water. 11. The East India Company treated shareholder returns as sacred, even when human beings were dying in enormous numbers. During the Great Bengal famine of 1770, millions of people starved while company officials continued collecting taxes and protecting investor payments in London. Revenue did not fall because the population was suffering. In some areas, demands became even harsher as administrators tried to compensate for lost income. The company's directors remained obsessed with dividends, keeping wealthy shareholders comfortable while Bengal collapsed under famine, disease, and economic destruction. This is where the familiar phrase, "business is business," becomes genuinely chilling. To the people making decisions from England, death appeared as reduced tax capacity and damaged revenue forecasts. The famine was a human disaster, but the corporate response treated it like an accounting problem. The East India Company did not invent greed, but it industrialized the ability to keep profiting while looking away. 12. Robert Clive, the man later associated with the company's rise in India, nearly vanished from history because of a pistol that refused to cooperate. As a miserable young clerk in Madras, Clive reportedly tried to take his own life twice in one afternoon. He pulled the trigger once, and the weapon failed. He checked it, tried again, and it failed a second time. Then he fired it elsewhere, and the pistol worked perfectly. A sensible person might have interpreted this as a reason to seek help. Clive interpreted it as proof that fate had personally selected him for greatness. That conclusion apparently did wonders for his confidence and terrible things for everyone standing between him and power. He abandoned the desk, became a soldier, won battles, accumulated wealth, and helped transform a trading company into an empire. Millions of lives were altered because one cheap firearm had inconsistent quality control. 13. The East India Company flag can look strangely familiar to American eyes. It displayed red and white horizontal stripes with the British Union symbol in the corner, creating a design that closely resembles the Grand Union flag used by the American colonies early in the Revolution. Historians still debate exactly how much influence the company banner had, but the visual similarity is difficult to ignore. That creates a spectacular irony. American revolutionaries fighting British authority may have adopted a flag style associated with the most powerful British corporation on Earth. It is like launching an anti-corporate rebellion and accidentally using the corporation's branding guide. The company was deeply involved in the political crisis that pushed the colonies toward revolution, yet its striped design may have helped shape early American symbolism. Freedom, independence, and just a tiny possibility that someone copied the logo from the enemy's shipping department. 14. The Boston Tea Party is usually presented as a simple rebellion against British taxation, but the East India Company was standing right in the middle of it. By 1773, the company had mountains of unsold tea and serious financial trouble. Parliament responded with the Tea Act, allowing the company to sell directly in the colonies and undercut local merchants. The tea was actually cheaper, but that was precisely the problem. Colonial traders saw a government-backed monopoly being rescued and handed special access to their market. The Sons of Liberty did not merely dump taxed tea into Boston Harbor. They destroyed corporate inventory connected to what looked suspiciously like a giant bailout. The protest was about political rights, but also about monopoly power and threatened livelihoods. In modern language, the American Revolution received a major boost from angry small businesses rejecting a subsidized liquidation sale from an overseas megacorporation. 15. Running a private empire required more than adventurous officers and relatives of shareholders, so the East India Company created its own training college at Haileybury. Young men, usually from comfortable British families, studied languages, law, economics, history, and administration before being sent to govern districts in India. It was essentially a factory for colonial bureaucrats, or Hogwarts, if the magic involved taxation, paperwork, and confidently mispronouncing local names. Students were trained not simply to trade, but to rule millions of people on behalf of a corporation. The existence of Haileybury reveals how far the company had moved from selling goods. Normal businesses train accountants and warehouse managers. This one trained judges, tax collectors, diplomats, and future governors. It needed an entire educational system to manufacture polished young men capable of running foreign provinces while maintaining the expression of someone mildly disappointed by the weather. 16. After Napoleon's defeat, Britain needed a prison so remote that escape would be almost impossible. The solution was St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic controlled by the East India Company. This meant the former Emperor of France ended his life on corporate property. The company supplied the island, managed much of its administration, and supported the machinery that kept Europe's most famous prisoner isolated from the world. Napoleon had once commanded armies, crowned himself emperor, and reshaped the continent. Now he was living on a windswept rock owned by a trading corporation, watched by guards, restricted by officials, and dependent on company logistics for basic supplies. It was an extraordinary fall. The man who challenged kings across Europe became, in practical terms, a difficult tenant inside the world's most secure company housing project, with absolutely no chance of getting his deposit back. 17. The East India Company became so influential that it helped decide what time millions of people followed. Before national time standards, towns set their clocks according to the local sun, which was charming until railways and military schedules demanded precision. To coordinate transport and administration, Madras time, calculated from the observatory in Madras, became widely used by the railways across India. For years, passengers and employees organized their lives around a clock system shaped by colonial logistics. That is an impressive level of corporate control. Most companies struggle to make workers attend a morning meeting. The East India Company helped standardize time itself. Imagine Apple announcing that noon will now occur 20 minutes later because it improves delivery efficiency, and then every railway station agrees. The company did not merely control land, taxes, trade, and soldiers. It also reached into the daily schedule and told people when the day officially began. 18. Gin and tonic may look like a relaxed evening drink, but its colonial origin was much closer to emergency medicine. British troops in India faced malaria, and quinine was one of the few available treatments. Unfortunately, quinine was so bitter that drinking it felt like being punished by a tree. Soldiers and officers began mixing it with water, sugar, lime, and gin to make the dose tolerable. The result eventually evolved into the familiar gin and tonic. In other words, one of Britain's most respectable cocktails began as a pharmaceutical delivery system for exhausted men trying not to die in the tropics. The gin was not simply there for elegance. It helped convince people to swallow medicine that tasted dreadful. Rarely has public health sounded so much like happy hour. Colonial survival apparently required discipline, mosquito control, and a medically responsible amount of alcohol served with citrus. 19. When the British government removed the East India Company from power after 1857, many European soldiers in company service did not celebrate. They mutinied. These men had signed contracts with the company, not with the crown, and they objected to being transferred automatically into the British Army. Their argument was basically that management could not change their employer without permission. They demanded discharge, payment, and transportation home. The resulting White Mutiny was a bizarre sequel to the much larger rebellion that had just shaken India. European soldiers who had helped enforce colonial rule now resisted their own government over employment terms. Patriotism became surprisingly negotiable once pensions and bonuses were involved. The incident exposed how commercial the company's military really was. Many of its soldiers were not serving an empire out of national devotion. They were working for a corporation, and they wanted the severance package written in the contract. 20. Behind the polite image of tea ledgers and gentlemen in powdered wigs, the East India Company operated one of the largest drug trafficking systems in history. Britain bought enormous quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China wanted very few British products in return. Silver flowed east, and the company hated the imbalance. Its solution was opium. The company expanded opium production in India and pushed the drug into China through illegal trade, creating addiction on a massive scale while claiming it was merely protecting commerce. The profits helped pay for tea consumed in British homes. That cozy afternoon cup was connected to fields in India, smugglers on the coast, corrupt officials, addicted families, and eventually war. The company did not accidentally become involved in narcotics. It built a business model around them because human misery was more convenient than accepting an unfavorable trade deficit. 21. Mumbai is now one of the most expensive cities on Earth, which makes the East India Company's original deal look almost criminally cheap. In 1668, King Charles II leased Bombay to the company for £10 in gold per year. He had received the islands through his marriage to Catherine of Braganza, but the distant, unhealthy territory seemed more like a burden than a prize. The company saw something better: a natural harbor, a strategic base, and a future commercial powerhouse. For the annual price of a modest dinner, it gained control of land that would become the financial center of India. This may be the greatest rental agreement ever signed by anyone not using a forged document. The crown escaped an administrative headache, while the company secured a port that helped expand its power across the Arabian Sea and deep into the subcontinent. 22. Robert Clive died in the 18th century, but a giant tortoise linked to him may have survived until the 21st. Adwaita, an Aldabra giant tortoise kept in Kolkata, was said to have once belonged to Clive and may have arrived in India during the company's early rise. While generals fought, kingdoms fell, famine spread, the company collapsed, and the British Empire eventually disappeared, Adwaita continued doing what tortoises do best: eating slowly and refusing to participate in anyone's crisis. The animal died in 2006 and was believed to be more than 200 years old, though the exact age remains debated. Even with that uncertainty, the image is perfect. A silent reptile may have outlived the corporation, the empire it helped create, countless political systems, 2 world wars, and nearly every human who ever tried to own it. 23. For much of its history, the East India Company restricted Christian missionaries from operating in its territories. This was not an inspiring defense of religious freedom. The company simply feared that aggressive conversion efforts would anger Hindu and Muslim communities, provoke unrest, and interfere with trade. Missionaries were denied passage, removed from company areas, or forced to work without official approval. The directors preferred predictable revenue to unpredictable religious conflict. In a strange way, corporate greed produced a temporary form of secular policy. The company was perfectly willing to conquer kingdoms and collect taxes, but it became nervous when preachers threatened customer stability. Saving souls sounded admirable until it endangered shipping schedules. The message was clear: Christianity mattered, but not enough to risk a riot near the warehouse. Profit remained the highest doctrine, and the only miracle management truly trusted was a steadily growing balance sheet. 24. British officers in India often complained about the shortage of unmarried European women, so a seasonal stream of young women traveled from Britain hoping to find husbands. This group became known as the fishing fleet, a term that somehow made marriage sound like commercial trawling. The women attended parties, dances, dinners, and social events where company officers evaluated them as potential wives. It was a 19th century dating show with tropical disease, no cameras, and extremely permanent consequences. Women who failed to secure a match could be sent back to Britain and cruelly described as returned empties. That phrase says everything about the system. A woman could cross oceans, survive months at sea, enter an unfamiliar society, and still be treated like defective cargo because she did not marry quickly enough. Romance under the company came with shipping schedules, social deadlines, and absolutely brutal customer reviews. 25. China guarded the secrets of tea cultivation for centuries, so the East India Company solved the problem through industrial espionage. It hired Scottish botanist Robert Fortune, who traveled through restricted tea regions in disguise, gathered plants and seeds, studied processing techniques, and smuggled the knowledge into British-controlled India. Fortune wore local clothing, altered his appearance, and relied on guides to enter areas normally closed to foreigners. This was not casual plant collecting. It was a corporate mission to break China's control over a hugely valuable product. Thousands of tea plants and large quantities of expertise were transferred to the Himalayas, helping create plantations that would compete with Chinese producers. Imagine stealing Coca-Cola's formula, kidnapping the scientists, and relocating the entire factory. The company did something similar with agriculture, then served the result in elegant cups and called it free trade. 26. After losing its army, territories, and governing role in 1858, the East India Company did not disappear immediately. It remained alive on paper for another 16 years, largely to settle accounts and continue payments connected to its shareholders. The empire-building machine had become a financial ghost. No conquests, no private government, no giant army, yet the corporate shell continued existing because wealthy investors still expected money. The company was finally dissolved in 1874, long after its practical purpose had vanished. This was an early version of Too Big to Fail, except the business had already failed and the checks kept arriving anyway. Imagine a retailer closing every store, firing every employee, losing its products, and then receiving government-supported payments for nearly 2 decades because the owners disliked the idea of consequences. Even as a corpse, the East India Company remained excellent at protecting capital. 27. The East India Company acquired the Koh-i-Noor diamond through a treaty signed after its conquest of the Punjab. But calling the agreement voluntary requires heroic imagination. The ruler who surrendered the diamond was Duleep Singh, a boy of about 10 years old. He had been separated from his mother, surrounded by powerful officials, and placed in a situation where refusal was hardly meaningful. The treaty transferred his kingdom and required the famous diamond to be handed to Queen Victoria. This was not a glamorous prize won in a fair duel. It was the political equivalent of adults cornering a child and demanding his family inheritance. The Koh-i-Noor later became part of the British royal collection, while the circumstances of its transfer remained deeply controversial. The company did not merely take land from rulers. Sometimes it placed legal documents in front of children and called the result diplomacy. 28. The Great Hedge of India was exactly what it sounds like. An enormous barrier of thorny trees, bushes, and branches stretching across much of the subcontinent. At its greatest extent, sections of this customs line covered thousands of kilometers and were guarded by an army of officials. Its purpose was not defense against invasion. It was built to stop people from moving salt without paying tax. The company and later colonial authorities treated salt, a basic necessity, as a source of monopoly revenue, then created a giant living wall to protect the income. Thousands of employees patrolled gaps, checked travelers, and watched for smugglers attempting to carry forbidden salt through the bushes. It may be the most aggressive hedge in human history. Entire communities faced high prices because the government had weaponized gardening. Bureaucracy looked at a tax problem and answered with 1,500 miles of thorns. 29. The East India Company's power did not come only from tea, textiles, and taxes. It also controlled access to Bengal's saltpeter, the essential ingredient in gunpowder. Bengal produced some of the world's highest quality supplies, and once the company dominated the region, European armies depended heavily on a private corporation for ammunition. During major wars, including the struggle against Napoleon, British forces needed enormous quantities of gunpowder, and the company profited from supplying the raw material. This gave a boardroom in London influence over whether soldiers across Europe could keep firing. Kings could boast about honor, generals could discuss strategy, and diplomats could threaten war. But none of it mattered if the powder ran out. The company sat near the beginning of that supply chain with its hand out. It was not simply selling goods. It was quietly controlling one of the chemical foundations of military power. 30. The East India Company demanded that many British soldiers in India wear heavy red wool uniforms designed for a much cooler climate. In tropical heat, this was not merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Men marched under brutal sun while wrapped in thick fabric because commanders valued appearance, discipline, and military tradition over basic common sense. Soldiers fainted, suffered heat exhaustion, and sometimes died while dressed as though they were preparing for a damp afternoon in England. Cotton existed. Lighter clothing existed. The problem was that neither looked sufficiently proper to officers obsessed with uniformity. This was corporate branding with fatal consequences. The company could adapt local taxation, trade networks, military alliances, and legal systems whenever profit required it. Yet changing a jacket apparently threatened civilization itself. Nothing represents imperial stubbornness better than watching employees collapse from heat, while management praises how professional everyone looks. Now prove we missed something. Name the East India Company crime, scam, theft, or absurd decision that deserved a place on this list, and do not waste the comments with the obvious ones. Make a case strong enough to earn a spot in Part 2. If this corporate nightmare surprised you, hit like and subscribe, because history's most dangerous companies rarely advertise themselves as villains.